So why do your photos or videos look blurry? One of the first things that's worth checking is, are they in focus, right? So in this case, it's like, is your camera set to manual focus when you wanted it to be an autofocus and you just didn't realize? And so everything's just blurred out because the focus is in manual mode and it's set for something really up close when everything's far away. That could be one thing right away. Does your camera even have autofocus or good autofocus? Because this might be something that you want to keep in mind when you're filming stuff, that maybe you're going to have to learn to pull focus manually on your lens instead of trying to rely on the autofocus to do things. Another thing is, do you have your auto settings configured in such a way where your ISO is being raised really high? So say you have like your aperture and your shutter speed geared in such a way where the ISO of your camera has to compensate for it being so dark, and as a result the ISO goes really, really high. Because as far as I understand, when you raise an ISO of a camera, at least when it doesn't have really good ISO capabilities, it's going to get noisier at some point. And even good cameras, there's going to be probably at some point a noticeable level of noise change. Some cameras might have less noticeable noise than others at certain settings, but if it gets really noisy, then at some point maybe that contributes to the image looking a little bit blurry. Again, it's going to be probably more of like a noisy, grainy look than just generally blurry. Like if it looks like out of focus blurry, then it probably because of your focus settings or you're not focusing it well or whatever. But if it's more of that kind of grainy blurry or whatever, like lack of visual fidelity, kind of messy look, then it might be because you have it set to like some auto exposure settings, or some things are set to automatic and some things are set to manual, and as a result the ISO has to compensate. An easy fix for that to a degree would be if you set the ISO to something that wasn't a crazy high number, and then you adjusted your aperture and shutter speed to make the image brighter, essentially making the aperture number as tiny as possible. So if you have an f2.8 lens, setting it at f2.8 and keeping that there. Now that's going to make the depth of field more shallow, so you're going to get a blurrier background, and also you're going to have to try to be even more sure that you're in focus, because it's going to be pretty easy to get out of focus when the depth of field is that shallow from the aperture number being so tiny. I say the aperture number being tiny, I say it that way because it's a bit easier to understand, because if people say like a high and low aperture or a fast aperture, like all these different words might sound confusing. So I'm literally talking about how tiny the number is. And 2 is tinier than 8, you know, in terms of it being a smaller number. So I'm trying to make it like pretty simple to understand in that way. Okay. And then you could also set your shutter speed to a slower number. So what that basically means is the shutter speed is how long the shutter is open to absorb light on the sensor. So if you have a shutter speed for 3 seconds exposure, it's going to be like 1, 2, 3, and it's going to shut again, and now the image has been captured. Whereas if it's a really fast shutter speed, it'll just kind of, you know, like that or whatever. Now technically shutter speed in video mode doesn't really work like that in terms of a mechanical shutter opening and closing. I believe it's done in like a digital sort of way. I don't really know how all that works. I'm making an assumption that it's done in a digital way. It's just kind of this setting that we just know that it's there, and that if you make the setting, you know, 1/800th of a second, that's going to make the image darker than 1/20th of a second, right? And you might only be able to adjust the shutter speed so low because I think you can only put the shutter speed as low as the frame rate, or maybe I should say like as slow as the frame rate, right? So if you're filming at, you know, 24 frames per second, you could probably only set the shutter speed as low as like 1/30th of a second, right? Because the 30 is like probably the closest number to 24, so you can't put it for like 1/10 of a second because you're shooting at 24 frames, and I think you need... I'm getting into something I don't know about when it comes to like what is the lowest shutter speed that you could set a camera to. I don't necessarily know if that's 100% correct, but you get what I mean. Like there's only so much play with the shutter speed. So, but regardless, making the shutter speed number like the 1/ whatever, everything after the slash, the smaller you can make that number, the brighter the image is going to be. So 1/50th of a second is going to make the image brighter than 1/1000th of a second, because the 1/1000th, that's like faster than the 1/10 or the 1/50th of a second, right? And think longer the shutter is open, you know, speaking, longer the shutter is opened, more light allowed to come in, but also the more motion blur you're going to get the longer that shutter stays open. Again, air quotes, shutter staying open, because when you're in video mode, you're not actually having a mechanical shutter doing that, at least not on our modern digital cameras. I don't know about the old film cameras like that. I don't know. But anyway, so does that answer the question? Anyway, I'm going to end that there. Hopefully I got some of that right. If you got questions about cameras, feel free to join my Skool community. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.